Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I have several questions related to the Lizzie Borden case. Can I analyze the case? Was she psychopathic? Can I talk about the mental health and personality characteristics in general? And was she guilty? So the Lizzie Borden case is an old case that involved murders that occurred in 1892. But it's still hotly debated in terms of Lizzie Borden's guilt or innocence, as well as her mental health and personality. So first I'll look at a timeline of the crime, then I'll talk about the background of Lizzie Borden, the arrest and the trial, the mental health and personality characteristics, and my thoughts as to whether Lizzie Borden was guilty or innocent. The case starts on August 2nd, 1892, at number 92, 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts. Normally residing at this house, we see Andrew Borden, age 69, Andrew's second wife, Abby Borden, age 64, Andrew's two daughters, Emma Borden, 42, and Lizzie Borden, 32, and Bridget Sullivan, a 26-year-old maid who worked for the family for almost 3 years. In July of 1892, Emma left to visit with friends, so she wasn't there during the time of the murders. So on this day, August 2nd, we see that Lizzie's stepmother, Abby, and the maid, Bridget Sullivan, suffered severe vomiting. Abby went across the street to a physician named Dr. Bowen and informed him that she believed that she was poisoned. The physician sent her home. The next day, August 3rd, Lizzie's uncle John Morse unexpectedly arrived at the house. That same night, Lizzie visited a friend of Emma's named Alice Russell. Russell would later testify that Lizzie had talked about burglary attempts on the Borden residence and indicated that there had been threats against her father. When Russell tried to comfort Lizzie, Lizzie said that she was afraid that somebody will do something. This brings us to August 4, 1892. John Morse leaves around 9 a.m. About 20 minutes later, Andrew Borden leaves to check on some of his investments. At about 9:30, Abby went upstairs to clean the guest room, and Sullivan went outside to wash the windows. So Lizzie was alone in the house with Abby. At about 10:45, Andrew returned from his walk. We see that he struggled to get the door lock open, and Sullivan let him in. Lizzie came down from the second floor at this time. Andrew inquired as to Abby's location, so he asked Lizzie where Abby was. Lizzie indicated that Abby had received a note asking her to go see a friend of hers who was sick. Sullivan ascended the back stairs to her room in the attic. She wanted to rest. It was about 11 o'clock. She knew this because she heard the bell at City Hall ring. At this time, Lizzie yells up the steps to Sullivan, "Come down quick, father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." Sullivan comes down the steps and sees the body of Lizzie Borden's father, Andrew. He had evidently been struck multiple times with a hatchet-like weapon. Lizzie sent Sullivan across the street to get Dr. Bowen. After he arrived, he asked for the police to be called. The police were already in the house when Sullivan and a neighbor went upstairs to find a sheet to cover Andrew's body. There they discovered Abby Borden laying on the guest room floor. Abby was also dead, having been struck many times with a hatchet-like weapon. So that's the timeline of the crime. Now to take a look at Lizzie Borden's background. So Lizzie was born in 1860. Her mother, Sarah Morse, died in 1862. 2 years after that, Andrew Borden married Abby Gray, who was 38 years old at the time. The evidence suggests that Abby was kind to Lizzie and her older sister Emma, but evidently the sisters did not return the affection. In particular, Lizzie and Abby's relationship was tense. Lizzie was reported to have said that she hated Abby. Andrew Borden has been described as a miserly and unscrupulous businessman. He became quite wealthy. By the time of his death, he was worth about $500,000. Now, of course, that's $500,000 in 1892. In today's dollars, that would be around 14 million. Even though he could have afforded it, he lived in a house that was not equipped with the conveniences that many people with his level of wealth had at that time. For example, the Borden residence didn't have electricity or a bath. Even though he was frugal, he did buy Lizzie expensive gifts. He paid for a tour of Europe, he bought her a diamond ring, and he bought her sealskin capes. That's something you don't hear too much of anymore, right? Capes in general. I guess they weren't just for superheroes back then. Both Lizzie and Emma had given up on the idea of getting married. However, Lizzie was active in her church, she taught Sunday school, she volunteered in a hospital, and was involved in a lot of other charitable activities. So now moving back to August 4, 1892, we see that the police described Abby as calm and collected immediately after the murders. They were surprised that Lizzie didn't faint at the sight of her father's body. Interestingly, this became an important factor in creating suspicion of her involvement in the murders. They noted that Lizzie's clothes appeared to be clean and her body appeared to be clean, not covered in blood as they initially suspected that the murderer must have been. However, they couldn't actually remember what she was wearing. The police really didn't get aggressive in their investigation quickly. They didn't make a meaningful search of the house until 32 hours after the murders, and they waited 3 days to conduct a formal interview of Lizzie or Emma. So within several days after the murders, we see Lizzie becomes the prime suspect. Abby weighed 210 pounds. The police didn't believe that Lizzie could be on the first floor and not hear Abby's body hit the floor when Abby was being murdered. Also, nobody came forward and claimed to be the person who sent the note to Abby, right? So we see Lizzie's story was kind of falling apart. Lizzie also changed her story several times. In one story, she claimed to be in the barn up in the loft during the time when her father was being murdered. The police insisted it was too hot that day for anybody to be in the loft. Also, the dust in that area appeared to be undisturbed. The police found the head of a hatchet in the basement. The handle was broken off and missing. Although one officer said they recovered the handle, it was never produced at trial. It was believed at that time that Abby must have been murdered at least an hour before Andrew. So the police were thinking about an hour to an hour and a half earlier. Later, these times would be disputed, but that was the conclusion at the time, which means the murderer had to stay in the house for over an hour between the murders, or they would have to have left and then came back later. So that would be pretty unusual behavior for somebody in broad daylight just walking around. So they're walking around, they're carrying an axe or a hatchet. A hatchet's really a smaller version of an axe. And they gain entrance into this house, they murder one person, and they hang out, or they leave and then come back right when the other person comes home. It doesn't make a lot of sense. All these things really hurt Lizzie Borden's case. On August 8th, Alice Russell witnessed Borden using a kitchen stove to burn a dress. Now, the dress appeared to have a small brown stain on it, so this could be confused with dried blood. Lizzie said that the dress had wet paint on it, and that's why she was burning it. That same day, Lizzie appeared at the inquest hearing. Just like during her initial statements, her answers were contradictory. She was on morphine at this time due to the stress of the murders. So this is something that's also changed quite a bit from 1892. Nobody these days would be given morphine because they're anxious or distressed, but back then this wasn't entirely unheard of. Now the local pharmacist came forward and said that on the day before the murder, Lizzie tried to buy prussic acid. Now this is a lethal poison that required a prescription from a physician. Lizzie told the pharmacist that she needed it to put an edge on a sealskin cape. He refused to sell it to her. Now, not everybody was jumping on board the Lizzie is guilty train. Many people believed that a daughter would be incapable of committing a double parricide. They believed that if Lizzie was the killer, she would have used poison and not used a hatchet or an axe. Also, the nature of the crime indicated a great deal of rage on the part of the murderer. People thought that this was inconsistent with a female killer. And between both victims, 29 blows were delivered by the weapon, some of them breaking through the bone. Many people didn't think that Lizzie had the capability to strike two people a total of 29 times and to generate the amount of force necessary to cause the damage that was observed. Strangely, many people sent letters asking that Sullivan be arrested, even though there was no evidence whatsoever that tied her to the crimes. In fact, really, Lizzie's testimony essentially exonerated Bridget Sullivan. So perhaps it was really more about the wealth and status that Lizzie possessed, as opposed to the idea that a female could not be a killer. A woman of her social standing could not have committed this crime, was really, I think, what a lot of people were thinking. Even though her guilt was debated on many levels, she was arrested on August 11. This moves us forward to June 5, 1893. Lizzie's trial begins. Her inconsistent statements and the attempt to purchase prussic acid are ruled as inadmissible. The prosecution has an uphill battle right from the beginning. Because of Lizzie's inheritance, she was able to hire a high-powered defense team, including an attorney named George Robinson. He was the former governor of the state of Massachusetts. He understood how people were looking at Lizzie and judging her behavior, like she wasn't sad enough, she wasn't reacting in the right way, and he told her to start grieving in an obvious way. The defense brought in experts that indicated Lizzie was physically incapable of swinging an axe with enough force to have done the damage observed at the crime scenes. Experts for the prosecution indicated that she was capable, and she could have done it without splattering blood. The jurors clearly didn't buy this story. It seemed very hard to believe that the murder would not be covered in blood. Now, this trial was overseen by a 3-judge panel. One of them, Justice Dewey, issued a statement to the jury, more or less telling them that a not guilty verdict really made sense. The jury decided in 5 minutes that Lizzie Borden was not guilty, but they did not return for about an hour, so people wouldn't believe they had rushed through the process. After the trial, Lizzie and Emma inherited about $300,000. That's roughly $8 million today. They bought a mansion. Lizzie was ostracized by the community that had once defended her, and we see that on June 1, 1927, she died from pneumonia. She was 66 years old. So that takes care of the investigation, the arrest, and the trial. Now moving to the mental health and personality characteristics we see with Lizzie Borden. Even though there's a lot of information available about this case, when it comes to Lizzie's mental disorder symptoms or her personality, we see mixed reports. The case predates the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual by 60 years, so there's no expectation of a diagnosis. The descriptions we hear of Lizzie suggest she might have been somewhat unhappy, but there's no indication of uncontrolled anger, impulsiveness, or irresponsibility. Other than the morphine she was given after the murders, there's really no indication of using substances either. Really nothing's going on here in terms of mental health symptoms, at least not based on available information. So now looking at her personality, I'll use the 5-factor model. I remember this through the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. There's not a lot to go on in terms of figuring this profile out, but if I had to guess, I would say mid-range openness, high conscientiousness, mid-range extroversion, mid to low agreeableness, and low neuroticism. And the level of neuroticism becomes important as we consider the type of crime she was accused of. Low neuroticism is associated with psychopathy. These murders were particularly brutal, and it's hard to imagine the perpetrator did not have several psychopathic characteristics. We know that one psychopathic characteristic, of course, is low neuroticism, the tendency to stay calm in stressful situations. That's one indication, but did she have any of the other characteristics? Is it possible that Lizzie Borden was a psychopath? We see this one study that analyzed the available information on Borden and tried to figure out how she would score on an instrument called the Psychopathy-Checklist Revised, also known as the PCL-R. I'll put a reference for this article and every source I used in the description for this video. Now, this instrument has 20 items that are linked to psychopathy. Now, this is an interesting article, but it was scored with the presumption that Lizzie was guilty of the murders, which means that her guilt or innocence was not independent of the psychopathy score. Rather, if she was considered guilty, the psychopathy score would be higher. So I don't think this is a really logical way to calculate the score, but I can appreciate this perspective, looking at the instrument as if she's guilty. With this limitation in mind, though, I'll review the 20 items and score Lizzie as if her involvement in the murders is really unknown, like we don't know if she's guilty or not guilty. These scores, the article scores and my scores, can then be compared to the scores of other female offenders, including female murderers. So as I go through the items, I'll give the article score and my score. Now, each item on the PCL-R can be scored with a 0, a 1, or a 2. 0 means that the item doesn't apply at all. 1, we see a partial match or mixed information, and 2, we see a reasonably good match. First, let's take a look at the PCLR items where no evidence supported endorsement. So these are items where Lizzie would score a 0, according to the article. Here we see superficial charm, grandiosity, excitement seeking, poor behavioral control, promiscuity, early behavioral problems, a lack of long-term goals, being impulsive, being irresponsible, having several short-term marital relationships, juvenile delinquency, and a revocation of conditional release. So for all these items, I agree with how the article scored them. I also give Lizzie a 0 on these items. Next, I'll look at the items that were endorsed, either with a score of 1 or 2, again, based on what the article says. And I'll give my score as well. So we see the remaining items of the PCLR are listed here. The first, pathological lying. The article gave a score of 1. My score is also 1. This is based on her inconsistent statements to the police initially and at the inquest. She was also suspected 3 years earlier of stealing money and jewelry from her parents' home. Next item is being manipulative. The article has endorsed this with a 1 because of Lizzie's alleged theft behavior and also alleged shoplifting that occurred 5 years after the crime in 1897. I'm putting a 0 here. Even if she committed those crimes, that's not necessarily manipulation. The next item is a lack of remorse. The article assigned a score of 2, saying that it's a reasonably good match. My score is 0. The lack of remorse was really based on her composure during the trial, but if she was not guilty, there was no need for remorse. Next, we have shallow affect. The article gave her a 2, based on the idea that she had a limited range of affect as a child, an adolescent, and as an adult during the trial. I can appreciate the argument here, but I'm going to go with a 1. I think we have mixed results there. Next item is being callous or having a lack of empathy. The article scored a 1. My score is 0. Limited expression of emotion during the trial, again, would only matter if she was guilty. Parasitic lifestyle is the next item. The article scored a 1 here. I think this is really more situational. Her father was wealthy. She volunteered. That's really not what's meant by a parasitic lifestyle. This lifestyle is when somebody really needs to work, they need to earn money, and they live off of other people and lounge around doing nothing meaningful. I don't think this applies in Lizzie's situation. My score is a 0. The next item is a failure to accept responsibility. The article gave her a 1, and I gave her a 1 as well. The only reason I'm okay with the score of 1 is because she did lie about what happened during the time of the murders. So something was going on there. She clearly didn't accept responsibility for something, although it's not clear if it was the murders. The last item is criminal versatility. The article scored it at a 1. The article score is based on repeatedly shoplifting, which is really not clear. They also mentioned that she was accused of killing a pet cat. This was never confirmed. And after this, of course, they talked about the double parricide. Again, that was not established. My score is a 0. So looking at this article, the total score on the PCLR was a 10. I came up with a score of 3. So even using their score, which I think overestimates Lizzie's psychopathy, we see Lizzie barely gets into the mild range. Mild is 10 to 19. So she's at the bottom end of that range. The average for a female in the general population is less than 5. The average for a female who survived trauma is 9. So this would be a little bit higher than those populations, but incarcerated female murderers score an average of 19, and female offenders in general typically range between 19 and 24. So based on the article, Lizzie's score is not consistent with female criminals. With the score that I gave her, she would really just be average. So that takes care of mental health and personality factors. Now moving to this idea of her guilt or innocence, right? Was Lizzie Borden guilty of murder? As I mentioned before, this is hotly debated. The law doesn't deal with constructs of guilty and innocent. They deal with constructs of guilty and not guilty. So to start with that question, clearly she was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That doesn't mean she didn't do it. It just means that the prosecution failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, looking at guilt versus innocence. First, I'll go through the factors that make her look guilty, and then look at the factors that point to innocence. So, looking at guilty. Abby dying first was important, right? So the order of the murders really pointed to the idea that Lizzie could have been responsible. Because Abby died first, Andrew was a widower. Lizzie would have received a smaller inheritance if Abby was the second to die. Lizzie made it seem like whoever the real killer was, that Andrew must have been the target. But a perpetrator in that situation would have had no preference as to who died first, and maybe they would have killed Andrew and let Abby live. Next item, the testimony from Alice Russell indicated that Lizzie predicted something bad was going to happen. So that doesn't look too good. The testimony from Russell indicated that Lizzie burned her dress. Also looks highly suspicious. We see the testimony from the pharmacist indicating Lizzie was trying to buy prussic acid. We see inconsistent stories initially and at the inquest. There's that missing note, right? That's suspicious as well. If somebody else did it, how did she not see the murder? Right? That's a tough part in this case. That house wasn't really large. And if there was somebody killing two people in it, especially considering this idea that the murders took place an hour and a half apart, Lizzie surely would have seen at least one of those murders. We see there was no forced entry and nothing was stolen. Another killer would have had to wait in the house for an hour or leave and come back. I talked about that before. Who would have done either one of those? And then we see this limited expression of emotion. Although I'm really not sure about this, no one really knows how they're going to react in a situation like that. What happened in this case was a very rare circumstance. So again, kind of putting too much stock in her reaction, I think, can mislead somebody. It can lead somebody away from more reliable and valid evidence in this case. Now moving to factors that make Lizzie appear innocent. So Alice Russell here was really a key witness. If she was lying, then crucial pieces of evidence would be gone. If the discussion about predicting something bad happening and the burning of the dress came from separate witnesses, that would be a lot more convincing. Interestingly, Russell testified that immediately after the murders, there wasn't a drop of blood anywhere on Lizzie's body or clothes. So in a sense, Russell was a bad witness from Lizzie's point of view, but she really helped her with that part. Now with that in mind, we see no one actually noticed any blood on Lizzie Borden. It's very hard to believe that she could commit this crime and not get blood anywhere on her clothes or on her body, or somehow that she could have changed so quickly. So she murdered Abby, so she could clean up after that, I suppose, because of the time, but then she murders Andrew. She had very little time to clean up. The reports indicated that her hair wasn't even disheveled. So a little hard to believe. The theory of the crime indicates that Abby was killed with an axe, but this occurred in such a manner where Sullivan did not hear. I find that to be a little unusual. This house was that well built where from the second floor to the attic, sound would not travel to that degree. Somebody being struck multiple times with an axe and falling to the floor. This suggests perhaps that Sullivan was involved, and of course that could mean that Lizzie Borden was not. Now, if Lizzie's problem was really with Abby, why kill Andrew? How did she know Andrew was coming home an hour and a half early? Usually he came by later, like for lunch. Was it originally her plan to wait 2.5 hours and hope Sullivan would not discover Abby's body? Now, I suppose it is possible that she made the decision to kill Andrew after killing Abby. So she killed Abby. That was her mission. Mission was complete. And she sat there and thought, well, now what's she going to do? And then Andrew comes home and she decides to kill him. So that's possible, but seems a little bit unlikely. Now, also pointing toward innocence, I think fairly strongly, would be the lack of psychopathy and the lack of narcissism. We also see no history of rage and no history of violent behavior. We're supposed to believe that somebody like this, somebody with this personality, escalated from nothing to a double parricide. There's been a lot of discussion around the motive, suggesting that the inheritance was the motive for the crime. But in this case, I don't really see a remarkable degree of motivation for Lizzie. She wasn't getting a lot above and beyond what she already had by committing the murders. She still had to split the inheritance with her sister. In this case, we also see no confession. She doesn't slip even once when she's in jail. All those people who visited her, not one time does she say that she did it. And of course, I think most strongly pointing toward her innocence is the lack of any physical evidence whatsoever tying her to the crime. Police didn't even know if the hatchet head that they found was the murder weapon. So, weighing all these factors of guilt or innocence, what's my theory? Well, of course, there's no way to know for sure. That's what makes this case so interesting. But I would say that there's better than a 50% chance that she is guilty. What really stands out for me is her inconsistent story, her prediction that something bad was going to happen, the fact that she was the only one there who could have done it based on what she said. Again, she essentially exonerated Bridget Sullivan, and the missing note. So if she was guilty, as I suspect, the circumstances here were highly unusual. Again, a double parricide, which is rare to start with. And this double murder committed by a person with no history of violence, who is not psychopathic, and who left no physical evidence. So a good case could also be made for her innocence. So that wraps up my thoughts on her guilt or innocence. I'll kind of end this video with just a few notes about this case. There's actually a lot of interesting things about this case. The public was initially mortified that the police would consider charging a woman with murder, especially a woman from a wealthy family. That sentiment has certainly changed since 1892. The other note here is really the appeal of this case. This case seems to ride on a razor's edge, right? You could believe she's guilty or innocent and make a good case for either side. So it's really a mystery. Believing in her guilt or her innocence means accepting something very unlikely must have happened. I know whenever I talk about popular criminal cases, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.